Hey there. Today I want to talk about population, underpopulation, overpopulation, and how people get a little too extreme in their interpretations of both of these concepts. Yes, again, we're doing an unproduced video. I seem to be incapable of producing a 15-minute video more often than every other week or so, but that's just sort of how it is. It takes a lot longer to do a 15-minute video than it does a 3-minute video. So for a very long time, throughout the 20th century, or at least in the second half of the 20th century, the main concern seemed to be overpopulation. That's what folks were worried about. I mean, the concern about this goes back to the very foundation of the study of demographics and population. I think it's Thomas Malthus, but Malthus is his last name, some British, probably priest or something, who inaugurated this modern study of population and demographics by writing that it was inevitable that people were going to starve to death, because that's just what happens. You know, people, they eat too much and then they breed too much, and there's too much of a population, and people die. And what's always very interesting about this guy Malthus, who was writing in the 1790s, is that every bit of history after him has disproved what he had to say. But it was still valuable, what he had put together, this concept of studying population and demographics and thinking about what kind of resources you might need to serve a population. But Malthus's prediction that famine and war and death is inevitable, with the amount of population that the world was carrying in his time, has been pretty roundly disproved. There was certainly a lot of war and death within 20 years of when Malthus was writing, and throughout the 19th century and the 20th century. But in the second half of the 20th century, yes, there was still a lot of war and death, but there was significantly less, and world population just went through to the ceiling. It was extraordinary, the amount of people that were just being born. And I think it was something along the lines of, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were around 1 billion people, and at the end of it, there were 7 or 8. Don't know the exact numbers, which are, honestly estimates anyway, but, we don't talk about that so much. Population exploded, and throughout the second half of the 20th century, this was a tremendous concern, to the point where I think it's part of just sort of the intellectual furniture of certainly anybody my age, that the world is overpopulated, we're going to run out of resources. It became very wrapped up in the environmental movement, which has become more and more dominant over the course of my life, and it's just the right way to think about things, that the world is overpopulated or what have you. But that's not actually been the way that economists or scientific students of population have thought about it for a couple decades at least. And I think now there's a dawning realization that we have a different concern. It's not actually overpopulation. We don't have to be as worried about overpopulation. It's actually underpopulation that people are getting concerned about now. I think by the early 2000s, we began to see serious risk of actual depopulation in developed countries. The United States was always an outlier on this. We always had a pretty good fertility rate. We always were pretty good at reproducing ourselves, both because, a little more religiosity in the United States, and also a high degree of immigration. So it was something that we, spent most of my adult life looking somewhat snootily askance at Japan, which is, I believe, already falling in population, and most European countries, which are at least forecast to start falling in population, just stopping replacing themselves, or maybe they already are falling in population. In the United States, we used to sort of look on at that somewhat snottily and say, oh well, that's not us. We're going to be successful forever. Of course, Donald Trump's 1-2 punch of sort of breaking the U.S. immigration machine and failing to handle this worldwide pandemic, and also just making people more hopeless generally. I believe there's some anecdotal information that U.S. fertility fell off a cliff the second he was elected, and that was just because, everything seemed a lot shittier. But that's a besides the point. Besides the point. But what I think is happening now is we're seeing a shift in popular consciousness, or at least a shift among nerds like myself in the way that we think about population concerns. And we've gone from the concern that, oh, overpopulation is the real problem and we have to be worried about just too many mouths to feed, and now the opposite problem, which is sort of demographic collapse, which is what do you do when, as is the case in most developed countries, including the United States, you've got a political system or retirement system that depends on a larger class of workers supporting a steadily dying set of retirees. What do you do when you've got a population structure where you've got, I don't know, instead of having 20% of the population be retirees, you've got 40 or 60% of the population is retired and expects 20% of the population that's workers to support them. I mean, those are fanciful numbers, but that's the real concern with underpopulation. Now, I don't want to say, despite how wrong Malthus and his successors were about the risks of overpopulation, despite what I think I'm going to talk about, something I've begun to call demographic millenarianism, this idea that underpopulation is guaranteed to bring us an apocalypse. As much as I, sort of want to critique both of those approaches, I don't want to say that underpopulation or overpopulation aren't concerns. They are real concerns. We do have to think about the weight on resources of the level of humanity we have. That's a good thing to think about. We do have to think about how in certain other countries, our political systems may not be able to support the lifestyles that we currently live right now. These are important dynamics. I don't want to say that you don't have to be concerned with overpopulation or you don't have to be concerned with underpopulation. What I do want to stress in today's video is that the approaches, the extreme approaches to these concepts from both sides are a little bit ridiculous. And I think I'm seeing in this consensus that's forming around demographic decline, the apocalypse that's coming because of the fallen population. I'm seeing in this like a lot of the same extremism that I see in the economists in the 1960s who were saying the whole world's going to starve to death by 1972. I think I'm seeing that same sort of overdone, to say the least, vigor on the other side of it now. I'm seeing people like Peter Zeihan or the YouTuber What If Altist that I'm trying to, I've been diving in on trying to write a critique of his work, who have this sort of assumption that is the flip side of, but is just as, I think, mistaken as the assumption that Thomas Malthus, or is it Paul Ehrlich, the population bomb people, I'm not sure if I'm getting that right. It's just the flip side, but it's the same sort of rigorous assumption that we know this one thing about population, and we're going to just extrapolate that out to everything that's going to happen, and it's definitely not going to change, and it's definitely going to be the case forever. There's a real parallel here, I think, in the contrast between peak oil and peak oil demand, which is another really interesting evolution I've seen over the course of my 20s and 30s. When I finished college, peak oil was sort of an article of faith. Everybody believed that we were going to run out of fossil fuels, and it was going to be a real problem. It was going to be catastrophic. Because, of course, at that point, oil prices were much higher than they are today. But everybody believed it. We're going to run out of oil. How are we going to deal with this disaster? By the 2020s, we're going to be living in some kind of Mad Max apocalyptic world. Well, of course, the concern over the past 7 years has been the opposite. It's been peak oil demand. It's been, we have too many fossil fuels. And if we want to avoid catastrophic global warming, we actually have to figure out ways to not use all of these bountiful fossil fuels. Of course, in recent months, it's looked a bit different. We're seeing some of the highest oil and gas prices since 2014. I think with gas, we're seeing some of the highest prices since 2008, which I suppose is just underlines the fact that while it's always interesting to know both sides of an argument and things about scarcity and what have you, um, taking it to an extreme in one direction is a mistake. I remain, by the way, on the side of lower for longer oil prices. I think this is a bit of a blip, and we're going to go back down. But I think it's sort of a same sense of criticism and lack of panic on population, I think, is a good idea. What is demographic millenarianism? I mean, millenarianism is this idea that the apocalypse is always coming. And now, if people who want to make their population arguments apocalyptic are now arguing, from the exact different direction. Japan's going to run out of people, or what are we going to do? China's going to get old before it's going to get rich. Now, to be clear, I mean, some of these are real concerns. I mean, Japan has, to some degree, Japan's past couple decades of, I guess, past 3 decades of economic underperformance do have something to do with demographic decline. China is in a position where its workforce is about to start shrinking, and that's going to be a real problem for it. So again, I'm not saying that these possibilities of over or underpopulation are not, real, but I'm saying that you shouldn't look at a current problem today as they were looking at a problem in the 1970s and say that this phenomena that is occurring today is guaranteed to be exactly the same for decades to come. With demographic decline, I think you can make the point, well, it's like, even if we changed everything today, it would be 25 years before the first, new population of workers that was born, would be able to be in the workforce. So really it's all baked in, it's guaranteed. I think I'm quite consciously critiquing stuff that Peter Zion says at this point. And it's like nothing is that baked in. Nothing is that guaranteed. I mean, we live in a world where there are still places in Africa that are dealing with population that is higher than they can usefully use. The idea that they have too many people and they can't feed them is actually not something that has really been a problem in the world since the age of European imperialism. Like when the British ran India, people starved to death all the time. Despite India being a very poor country, we haven't had a big famine in India since 1947. Even really iconic famines like Ethiopia in the 1980s, that was entirely a political problem, a communist dictatorship. The really horrific famine and food insecurity going on now in Yemen, that's all about a Saudi invasion. It's actually political nightmares that cause famine. The only famines we have seen for the past century have been a result of politics, not some natural constraint, not something that just sort of automatically happens. So we have choices, and it's choices that people make that lead to problems around overpopulation, and it is choices that people make that lead to problems around underpopulation. In Africa, mostly countries in Africa at this point, there are young folks who want to go work, and the United States used to do a pretty good job of taking young folks from Africa to come over here and work and pay into our systems. And we decided to stop doing that under Donald Trump. There's some signs that actually might be restoring to some degree. We should obviously do more of that. But yeah, I mean, some people say that Asian countries are just automatically too racist to allow large-scale immigration. That was said for decades around Japan. I said that about Japan. I believed it. But a less celebrated or less noticed aspect of Abenomics, Shinzo Abe, the guy who was in charge of Japan until recently, was actually starting mass immigration in Japan. So yeah, they're handling that issue. So I think that as with overpopulation, which is mostly, the truly chaotic effects of overpopulation are mostly about politics and war, the truly chaotic effects of underpopulation can actually be very easily ameliorated by immigration in the short term. In the long term, I think more serious things are going to change. There's a real dynamic that with urbanization, with women's rights, you stop having families with 6 or 7 children, and that's, I would say, a good thing. Yeah, for sure, a good thing. But that doesn't mean that you automatically plummet from 6 or 7 children to 1.2 children, or under, zero point 0.8 children per family, or whatever, where I think we're getting to in some places. That you don't automatically fall all the way down there. I think there's a lot of social science at this point that says that actually there are a lot of folks in the United States who would like to have larger families. They just simply can't fucking afford it. And there's, I think, a lot to be said about the way that we've just structured our country over the past 40 years. I think a lot of folks say, well, sorry, it's all over now that we're urban, and now that, women are allowed to vote, we're never going to have more than 2 kids. We're never going to have more than one designer kid per couple anymore. And I don't think that's true. I don't think there's any actual social science that supports that. I think that if we had like more of a FDR style approach to social spending in the United States, like, I don't know, maybe shift a couple $100 billion away from the Pentagon to things like child tax credits. I mean, these are things that we're already trying. We're already developing social science support. We're already running experiments. To be clear, some of the countries that have made the biggest deals about, we're going to be pro-natalist, we're going to have bigger families. I think Hungary has had a huge push behind that recently, and it hasn't gone very far. But I think the French have been more successful with that. And I think it's very possible if, especially as the sort of general tone of things shift, I think it's very possible that what looks like a guaranteed demographic apocalypse to a lot of people right now won't look that way 5 to 10 years from now. I think we've switched, the pendulum has swung from everybody being super concerned about overpopulation. I mean, that's where China's one-child policy came from, all the way back to, now everyone's super concerned about underpopulation. And I think, these are valid concerns, but I don't think we should make the same mistake that somebody always makes, which is to assume that the conditions today are guaranteed to be the conditions tomorrow. So that was a ramble on population. Thanks to Scott Locks, one of my patrons, for suggesting that topic for an unproduced video. I mean, the patrons don't just support this channel. They sometimes tell me what to cover, or suggest what I cover. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll have some kind of video on what if alt hist. I know I promised that months ago. In the next couple weeks. Thanks so much. Please like, subscribe. Let me know what you think. Did my ramble on population make any sense? Anyway, thanks.